This happened when I was about 12 years old. Back then, we had to move out a lot because of my dad's job. Sometimes we had to live in far rural areas for years. Some of the houses we lived in were old, creepy houses that give off an eerie atmosphere. But however creepy they were, nothing can compare to what happened in this very house. The house was a rustic wooden house, probably built a few good decades before we moved in. It was situated in a large, secluded compound in the suburbs, far from the neighborhoods. I'm not sure how old it is, but the balusters of the staircase were beautifully crafted. But the old house must have been unoccupied for a long time, because on the first day we arrived, the entire place was covered in dust and cobwebs. I didn't know back then why they would leave a grand old house without any housekeeper. There were 3 bedrooms and all of them were upstairs. Downstairs, there were a living room, a kitchen, and a storage room. The previous owner kept old broken down things in the storage room and kept it locked. The entire house was painted in wild reds, so it always looked dark and gloomy. My family consisted of the 4 of us: my father, my mother, my sister, and me. I was the youngest of all and was probably the least brave. I've never slept alone in a room before we moved here. But now, my parents forced me to sleep alone in my own bedroom just because there were 3 bedrooms in our new home. In fact, the storage room was directly beneath my bedroom. I could always smell the moldy odor from the room beneath me. At night, I could always hear something scratching, shuffling, or creaking. I've had so many sleepless nights because of those sounds. But the worst of all was that weird, rotten smell I could sometimes get. But no matter what smells we get or what sounds we hear, we were told by the previous owner to not open the door to the storage room. Only the owner would know what he's locked up inside that room. I tried to tell my parents about the sounds I heard and the smells that have been keeping me up all night, but they would casually dismiss them as rats or other critters. That's why the storage room gives me the creeps the most. I've always had the feeling that the sounds or the smells were because of anything but rats. So, I decided I had to do something about it. I told myself that it was probably my colorful imagination that's making up things. That night, while I was trying to sleep under my blankets, I heard the usual sounds of scratching and shuffling. Despite having heard of those sounds every night, it still unnerved me. I became nervous and scared until I had to make up my mind that there was no way of dealing with this if I'm scared. So I mustered up all the courage I had and whispered under my blankets, "If there are any spirits or entities here, please show yourselves." And waited. Nothing seemed to happen, so I got a little braver. I removed my blanket and repeated once again. This time I couldn't even hear the shuffling noises from earlier. By the time I finished the second question, I was no longer scared. Relieved, I lay down on my bed, and for the last time, I knocked on the floor 3 times. In the dead silence of the night, as soon as I finished knocking, I heard it from the floor beneath me. This is the experience that I will never forget. It happened when I went on a business trip to a small town with my colleague Tim and the driver. The 3 of us went to the bar on the night we arrived, We ranted about work and whatnot, and eventually our conversation led to paranormal stuff. The two of them believed in ghosts, whereas I didn't. We continued to argue for a while, and then Tim says, "Hey, we're gonna have to stay in this town for the next 2 days, so if you dare to stay at the local cemetery from midnight to 1 in the morning, the two of us will buy you dinner. If you don't, you'll be the one to buy us dinner. Deal?" Truthfully, even though I didn't believe in ghosts, I felt uncomfortable with the idea of having to stay at the graveyard alone. But I didn't want to be seen as a coward, so we made the deal. We parted ways at around 11. I walked alone to the graveyard, and the two of them returned to the hotel. The graveyard was just beside the riverbank. While I was making my way towards the entrance with the pleasant buzz in my blood, it started to rain heavily. I cursed at myself for not bringing my umbrella during the rainy season. I had to look for a shelter where I could wait out the rain. Luckily, I found a canopy only a few yards away and I ran there fast. Only when I got near that I realized there was already someone inside, sitting beside the fireplace. I figured he was a caretaker because who sits alone at a cemetery in the dead of the night? Anyways, I was relieved to have someone with me in a place like this. I asked the man if I could come in, although it was a public place. As soon as I sat down and saw the man's face, I almost regretted coming here. The man's face was as pale as bones. His lips looked bluish and his entire face looked somewhat swollen. He seemed to have been drenched by the rain like me. I asked him if I could join him by the fire. I didn't catch his reply, but it looks like he nodded his head a little. A moment later, he asked me in his croaky voice what I was doing in the graveyard. I was more than happy to explain everything to him. Once I finished talking, the man laughed dryly before his bulging eyes stared into mine. "So you don't believe in ghosts, do you? Actually, this place is famous for hauntings," he said in his mumbly voice. His revelation gave me chills along my spine. But I swallowed my fear and asked him what happened. So he began. "There used to be a dock around here some time ago, and there was this young man who worked as a boatman at that dock. In short, he and a rich young lady who frequents the dock fell in love. But the girl's parents did not approve of their relationship, and so the couple planned to run away together. The young lady agreed to do so and decided to wait for him at the riverbank on a full moon night. However, the girl's parents found out about the plan and locked her up inside the house, preventing her escape. The young man didn't know about it, so he waited for her at the riverbank for hours and hours. When he realized she wasn't going to come, he gave up and rowed back to the other side of the river. The unfortunate young man got caught in the heavy wind and rain, just like today, at the middle of the river. The wind and the rain overturned his boat, and the young boatman drowned to his death. Since then, people say that the young man's ghost can be seen on days of heavy rain. I gazed outside as the man finished his story. The rain had almost stopped. My clothes were nearly dry from the heat of the fireplace, and the time was up for my little bed. It was time to head back to my hotel room. When I turned to say goodbye, I screamed in horrified realization. The man was still drenched in water, just like when I first saw him, and his bulging dead eyes staring straight at me were the last thing I remembered before I blacked out. When I regained consciousness, I was already at the hospital, and the events of that fateful night still continues to haunt me to this day. The Ghost on the Highway. My work requires me to go on trips to Napier frequently. When I've done my work, I go back to my hometown as soon as possible. I don't spend the night there to cut down on unnecessary expenses, so I drive home whether it's day or night. I rarely go alone. My assistant accompanies me most of the time, but this time he didn't come along as he had taken leave due to his mother's illness. By the time my work was done, the sun had already set. It was about 8 p.m. when I left the town. There were hardly any cars on the highway. Without the traffic, I had to keep myself from falling asleep by counting the list of things I had to do the next day. As much as I remember, when I was around Pew, I saw someone sitting on the side of the road about 100 yards away. The person saw my car and then suddenly stood up and walked towards the direction of my car. I could see that it was a man carrying a big basket in one arm. His face looked like he was smiling, and overall he looked very strange. The man raised his hand as if to hitch a ride, so I hit the brakes, but since my car was on full speed, it only stopped several meters away from the strange man. I was undecided, but I thought at least I have someone to talk to on the road rather than doze off alone. So I decided to give him a ride and beckoned the man to come over. The man walked towards my car slowly. I watched the man from the rearview mirror and felt something was off. The way he was clutching his basket and dragging one of his feet with each step seemed very weird, especially at the dead of the night. His face with a strange look was dimly lit by the brake lights. I felt more and more uneasy as the man got closer, so I hit the lever and drove away. I saw the strange man was standing on the road, staring at my car as I drove away. After driving about 5 minutes on full speed, I felt relieved and returned to my normal speed. A moment later, when I almost reached the bridge, I saw someone under the bridge lights. My fears returned. He must have seen me coming. When the man picked up the big basket from the ground, I was certain that it was the same man from before. The bridge lights revealed his smiling face as he looked up. Seeing the face of the same man I drove away from minutes ago completely shook me, and at that moment, I was more than sure that it was not human at all. I thought it was possibly the ghost of someone run over on the highway, a roadkill. The man's smile did not even falter as he begins to approach the bridge. But luckily, I could drive past the man just before he got to the bridge. I was saying every single prayer I knew, and when I looked from the rearview mirror as soon as I passed the bridge, I saw no one under the lights. This time I was scared out of my wits and drove without slowing down at all. I peeked at the rearview mirror often just in case there was another car on the road to follow. However, there was no sign of other vehicles on either side of the highway. As I was staring into the rearview mirror, my car ran over something. I pushed the brakes at once. I checked the front and back of my car, but there was nothing. When I drove forwards a little, it sounded like something was being dragged underneath the car. So I stopped and got out of the car right away. Outside was completely dark and silent. There was only the sound of my car engines and lights. I crouched down to check under the car, but there was nothing under the car belly. I opened up my phone's flashlight just to make sure that nothing was underneath. And then I saw a pair of mangled legs enter the back seat and heard the door close. I was so petrified that I even forgot to scream. Then I saw a car approaching, so I hurried and tried to hitch a ride. I explained everything to the kind driver and hitched a ride back home. Ever since the incident, I never drove on the highway alone or at night.